As high school graduates enter a new phase of their lives, how prepared are they for the real world of today and, more importantly, of tomorrow? What will the job landscape look like in 10 years? According to a report from PwC, a global shift to artificial intelligence could have automated bots taking nearly 4 in 10 jobs in the United States by 2030. International education speaker Ravi claims that as technology takes over, our identities will no longer be formed by our careers, and if we don't have something else that grounds us, we run the risk of disaffection. He joins us today to discuss how we can bridge cultural divides and use cultural competence to better prepare our children for life in the adult world. Welcome, Ravi.
Hi, Lisa. Great to be here.
Thanks for being here. So why do you think that cultural competence is the solution for the possibilities of disaffection?
Well, I think when we look at what's happening and the statistics that you just quoted from PricewaterhouseCoopers shows us that in all likelihood we are going to have a society that's dominated by artificial intelligence. And, of course, we're also becoming more globalized. And our children are growing up in a much more global society than previous generations. Yeah. So if we're no longer going to be defined by jobs and careers, we have to figure out what it is that we base our identities on, because currently that is often, the first question that we ask each other. So
right. What do you do?
Exactly. And I think, now looking forward, that question is going to have to be reshaped, and it's probably going to be something along the lines of, what do you believe in, or where do you come from? And so we have to have some level of cultural competence. And cultural competence is really comprised of several things, which includes understanding your own cultural identity, your own cultural background, and your own implicit biases that form some of the things that we have to deal with in society, like racism and classism and other forms of discrimination. And once we understand our own implicit biases and how they are culturally rooted, we can be open to other people's cultural differences. And if you think about it, in a global society, this is going to be so important because we just have to get along. And from an educational perspective, if we're no longer going to be educating for jobs and careers because that's no longer what identifies ourselves or how we identify ourselves, we're going to have to pivot in education and shift the focus to what I believe, ultimately it's what is the purpose of education for the future? It's to create peace. It's to make sure that we can all get along and work together to further humanity.
Do you think that public education now is preparing students for this kind of future?
Well, I think that it can, but there's so much pressure right now on public education. We have so many different things going on. There's a narrative, first of all, that public education is broken, so we're hearing things that we need major school reform. My belief is more that small shifts in education will make big changes in the world. So, I think that public education has a lot of pressure right now because there are budget cuts, there is school choice, there are things that are taking away funding from public education, and at the same time, we're seeing a reduction in guidance counselors and school nurses and psychologists, and teachers are being asked to pick up that ball, and that's a lot of required professional development and, frankly, a distraction from the basics of education. And I think if public education could really focus on really the primary elements of what it means to educate a child and provide those basics, then we are giving students an array of tools that will allow them to pivot throughout their future. And I keep saying the word pivot. That's actually the name of the book that I'm writing right now, because I think it's the most important skill of the future is to be able to teach kids to pivot.
I love the little tease for your book, by the way, too. I mean, just, I happen to be writing it, so if you happen to hear my name in the future...
Hey, listen, he's pivoting while he's talking about it.
It seems...
it just happens to be the case. What can I say?
Exactly. I love it.
It seems like a pretty big ask of people, though, right? To know who they are, to be able to look introspectively at themselves and say, well, maybe I do have a bias towards a certain group of people or a certain way of thinking. I mean, that is a tremendous ask of people. Do you think that we as a human race are going to be able to get to that point or can attain that?
Yeah, I do. I'm not sure that it's that big of an ask because I think in some ways we're born that way. We're born curious about others. We're born to be creative. And in some ways, our society and the lanes that we put children in chip away at that natural curiosity about ourselves and about each other, and chips away at that creativity. But there are things that can be done that really facilitate that process. And I've had an interesting career that's gone through rock and roll and aviation, cultural diplomacy, and keynote speaking. And one of the things that I say in my speeches to educators is that the cockpit of an airplane was the greatest classroom I'd ever been in. And one of the reasons is because it forces you to be so aware of yourself and your surroundings, and your life depends on it. And those types of project-based learning activities, like learning to fly an airplane, are the things that make those requirements for our future not such a big ask, and it actually can be folded into part of curriculum. Not everybody can go out and fly an airplane, of course, and there'll be a huge liability associated with that.
Yeah, right.
But there's no reason why every school in America and beyond can't have a ground school course, a syllabus, and a desktop flight simulator to help teach some of these life skills that are attained through activities and projects like learning to fly an airplane.
Okay, let's talk more about these specifics. You founded a global school network called Ravi Unites Schools. What is it, and why did you start it?
Well, it's really interesting. It was about 10 years ago. I'm a partner in a boarding school for the poor in India, and we teach. We take kids out of the villages before the age of 4, and we pay for their education up to their master's degree.
Wow.
And I was at the school it's really remarkable. These kids are working for Fortune 500 companies now, and it's wonderful. And when I was at the school about 10 years ago, I went from there straight to Los Angeles to start working with some foster kids. And I was telling these kids about my new students in India. And they were so intrigued that I said, hey, do you want to do a Skype chat with the kids in India? And they said, yeah. And so I called up the school in India. I said, do you guys want to do a Skype chat with the kids in Los Angeles? And they said, yeah. So I was really nervous now. So I didn't know what they were going to talk about.
Right.
I scripted a 30-minute script. Within 10 minutes, they were off my script. 90 minutes later,
of course,
they were still talking.
Wow.
And when they ran out of things to talk about, they started showing each other dance moves, and the whole thing ended with the kids in India beatboxing and the girls in Los Angeles dancing in real time. And I thought, wow, this is really powerful. This is something to expand upon. So over the next decade, really, but mostly in the last 2 years, I developed the Ravi Unites Schools Network, which is over 100 schools around the world. And I create these 45-minute online interactions between student groups in one country and student groups in another country. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Chile, and I did a couple there with schools in Tucson, Arizona, and Fort Meade, Maryland. And it's all based on that original interaction, but now it's become this network. And, going back to what I said earlier in our conversation, kids are naturally curious about each other. And if we give them these opportunities to have some peer-to-peer learning and to use technology like Skype that we all have in our pockets, in our phones, to create these online dialogues, we can achieve cultural competence at a much faster rate than through any other program, I believe.
We're talking with Ravi Hutty Singh about cross-cultural communications and competence. We're talking about curiosity. One of the things that you dropped, and I can't help but pick up, is you mentioned that not only have you been an entrepreneur and an
I know where you're
aviator,
going.
you also said rock star, and I just have to know what is it that you learned or took from that experience that has kind of led you to be either more aware, more introspective, or speaking to the subject that you do?
Well, that's a great question. And, it's interesting. My time in Hanson back in 1997, where we had number one hits and outsold pretty much every other band on the planet. When I look back at that time, I think of it as the Harvard Business School of rock and roll, because I learned so much about the music industry, the industry that I love. And it really prepared me to launch an entrepreneurial model in the music industry as the record label started to collapse just a couple of years later. And to form that was sort of my first entrepreneurial endeavor, and that's when my public speaking began, because I was talking about it at music universities and music conferences and things like that. But the Harvard Business School of Rock and Roll was also the Harvard Business School of Millennials, because Hanson was one of the first millennial bands on the planet. And I learned so much about that generation and what their mindsets were and their values were, that when I got into aviation and realized that there was a shrinking pilot population because it was an aging population that couldn't attract millennial pilots, I got into speaking about generational bridging, because I had this experience and intimate knowledge, really, of how the millennial generation clicks. And so I did a lot of keynote speaking in aviation about that generational bridging. And now I find that the same topic expands to many other industries, including education, because there's a teacher shortage, and they're having a hard time attracting millennial teachers. So I got into education speaking about the generational bridging, but now it's more about equity and cultural competence, which, by the way, are both values that are very important to the millennial generation. So it all connects rather well.
You know, we started off talking about this conversation as on a topic that I like to talk about is basically, when do the robots take over, and how do we fit into to this new model? You know, and I joke, but I do love a good science fiction story. But we're talking about a new landscape that we are predicting, right? The future job market for the next generation, for our generation that will have to reinvent themselves again and yet again. And so these are all based on predictions and what is most probable in the future. And so I am curious, as you are talking about equity and cultural competence and bridging the gaps between generations and all these things, what do you think is the most important skill that we can have to prepare us, and how can we best teach it?
Well, I think really it is that skill of being able to pivot. And a lot of that in a global society does come down to being culturally competent, because cultural competence is a required skill in order to develop your network. And as they say, your net worth is your network. So it's very important to be able to have those social skills and that cultural competence in order to build a global network that allows you to pivot throughout your future. You know, the director of the lab on aging at Harvard Medical Center says that the first person to 150 has already been born. So think about how many times someone's going to have to pivot through a lifetime that is that long. And then you think about the fact, the prediction that, in 10 years, almost 40% of jobs will be automated. Yeah. And what that also tells us in that same PwC report is that the half-life of a tech skill today is only about 4 years. So we have to be very careful in terms of the lanes that we put our students in and how narrow those lanes are in terms of preparing them for a tech skill or a vocational skill, because the half-life may only be about 4 years. And then what happens? They may not have a job. They may not relate to their education. And that's where the disaffection comes in, because they don't relate to any of it. And disaffection is a very dangerous thing for society, because it's what contributes to radicalism and all sorts of other extremes. So I think that ability to pivot, which means making sure that we're exposing our students to a wide array of interests and sparking their curiosity, combined with developing their social skills and their cultural competence, is really the key to developing a well-rounded student who's going to be able to function through a lifetime that may last 150 years.
We have time for one more question, and in that question, I can't help but ask, what does the future hold for you? How do you think that you're going to be pivoting?
Yeah, well, when I look back at my past, it's been just a series of pivots. And again, not to shamelessly plug the book again, but the biographical aspect, the narrative of the book is about my own pivoting. And it's made my life very interesting. And now, I have these great opportunities to give back or to continue paying it forward.
Or playing music. Are you going to play some more music?
Yeah, well, music is still a huge part of my life, because one of the programs that I do is creating songwriting workshops around the world to bring together people from traditionally opposed cultures and religions. And this is supported. This is part of my cultural diplomacy that's supported by the State Department, which is great. So I get to go to countries like Indonesia and have Sharia law Muslims write songs with Catholics. And I went to Iraq and had Iraqis and Kurds do it. Next year I'm doing it in Chile with the indigenous tribes and Chileans. So music is still a key part of what I do. And I believe it's it has to be a key part of education as well, because it's one of those processes that experiences and activities that really does unite the world. And that's what I'm all about, which people can read at my website, raviunites.com. It's all about uniting.
Thank you so much for being with us, Ravi. This has been a really interesting discussion, and I appreciate the ways that you are trying to unite different cultures and in the future and now. Ravi Singh has served as a cultural diplomat for the U.S. Department of State and international education speaker. He's created art programs that bridge cultural divides in many countries, including Iraq, Russia, and Indonesia. As a top keynote speaker in education, Ravi's client list is full of the best education leadership associations in the world. It's been a pleasure to have Ravi on the show today. To learn more about Ravi and his work in cross-culture education, please visit raviunites.com. That's RAVI Unites.com.